Tonight, you wake before the light, before the rooster, before the gray edge of morning has even decided whether it truly wants to arrive. The dark inside the house is thick and close, settled beneath the rafters and pressed into the corners where the broom never quite reaches. The air smells of ash, damp wool, old straw, last night's broth, and the faint animal warmth that clings to any small medieval house trying its best against weather. Beside you, somewhere in the dark, a child gives a sleepy little sigh and turns over. Near the hearth, the dog raises his head, listens to nothing in particular, and lets it drop again. Outside, there is wind moving low over the yard, touching the loose thatch, worrying the crooked latch, and reminding the whole world that winter is never very far away, even when the season claims otherwise. You lie still for one moment longer. That moment matters. It may be the quietest thing that belongs entirely to you all day. Your hands rest in your lap beneath the blanket, and in the dark you feel how sore they are before you see them. The backs of them are cracked near the knuckles. One fingertip is rough from thread and spindle and the edge of the quern. Your shoulders still carry yesterday in them. Your lower back remembers the water bucket. Your knees remember the hard floor beside the fire. Your breasts may ache. Your temples may throb. Your stomach may already be hollowing itself in preparation for another day of giving more than it receives. But still, this tiny pause remains. Then it ends. You push back the blanket, and the cold finds your ankles at once. There are no soft mornings here, no gradual transition into consciousness, no time in which your body is allowed to belong only to itself. Morning in your world is a list of things that must be prevented from failing. The fire must not die. The children must not wake hungry into panic. The grain must be ground. The water must be hauled. The dough must be checked. The pot must be scrubbed. The animal feed must be remembered. The cloth must not mildew. The roof must not be ignored. There is no one task large enough to be called heroic, and yet together they form a mountain most men would prefer not to see too clearly. You rise and wrap your shawl around your shoulders. It smells a little of smoke, and a little of rain, and a little of your own skin. Everything smells of something in a house like this. The floor is cold earth and packed rushes, uneven where feet have worn their habits into it over the years. You cross the room with care, because in darkness you know where each board or packed patch tends to complain. At the hearth, last night's embers sleep under a drift of gray ash. You kneel. The posture is as familiar as breathing. With a stick you scrape the ash back, patient and practiced, until you find the faint orange seam beneath it. There you are. Coaxing a fire is not dramatic. It is intimate. Too hard a breath, and you scatter it. Too soft, and it sulks. Too much kindling, and you smother it. Too little, and it gives up on you altogether. You feed it scrap by scrap, bits saved for this hour, dry enough if fortune has been decent, and leaning in until your face is warm and your knees are numb and the first timid crackle answers you. Then another. A line of light appears. Flame follows slowly, like an old thought returning. In a medieval house, fire is less a tool than a relationship. Something to be tended, remembered, trusted, and occasionally feared. Let it go out, and the morning becomes humiliation at once. Because then you must go next door and ask a neighbor for coals. It is not ruin, but it is failure. And women live close enough to failure already. When the flames are steady, the room begins to emerge. Straw at the edge of the sleeping area, the stool with one slightly shorter leg, the chest with folded cloth, and little else. The bundle of herbs overhead, the cracked bowl beside the wall, one child's heel poking from under a blanket. the dog now fully awake and hopeful for crumbs that do not yet exist. This house is not pretty in the way future centuries will pretend cottages were pretty. It is not quaint, not rustic in a painted book sort of way. It is simply trying not to collapse into cold, hunger, damp, and disrepair. That effort, repeated daily, is what most medieval domestic life really looks like when the romance is stripped away. You begin breakfast, if breakfast is the right word for food whose chief virtue is that it exists. A heel of dark bread from yesterday, a little hot ale or water to soften it, perhaps cheese if luck visited, perhaps onion, perhaps nothing but bread and heat. You break pieces for the children first because mothers do that almost automatically. Not because they are saints, but because a crying, hungry child undoes the whole room faster than adult hunger does. One child wakes weeping, another wakes demanding, another wakes cheerful, which somehow is just as exhausting before dawn. Their hair smells of sleep and soot, their shifts are twisted, one foot is bare. You wipe a face with the corner of your apron and tell them to wait just a little longer. This is your life as a medieval woman, though you would never call yourself that. You would call yourself by your name if anyone asked. But names are not what structure your day. Duties do. Wife, daughter, mother, widow. If it comes to that, brewer, spinner, baker, mender, nurse, keeper of the fire, rememberer of the 100 little things that prevent a household from fraying open. The records of the age, when they notice women like you at all, notice you mostly when something legal, scandalous, or catastrophic happens. Yet every ordinary day is full of your decisions. How much grain to keep back, which child looks feverish, whether the cabbage can stretch one more meal, which cloth may yet be mended, which neighbor needs checking on, which herb to dry before the rain, which part of the roof must be patched before snow returns. No charter records this, no seal confirms it. The house knows it. That is enough. The room is still only half visible. But your body no longer needs sight for most of its work. You know the placement of things the way a river knows its own stones. The ladle hangs slightly askew from the peg beside the hearth. The better bowl is tucked behind the cracked one, because children always reach for what survives best. The little bundle of dried thyme is tied higher than the others, because the dog once got into the lower bunches and sneezed for an entire afternoon. The mending basket sits under the stool with the wobbling leg. A small heel of yesterday's bread waits in the cloth by the chest. Even in the dark, your hands reach toward the right objects, almost without needing you. That is its own kind of intelligence, one of the countless domestic literacies women carried in their bodies, without ever being invited to name them. Outside, the sky is still a rumor. You can feel the weather before you properly see it. A certain damp in the air means the path to the well will be slicker than yesterday. A certain stillness means frost has settled hard enough to silver the yard and rim the bucket with cold. A certain smell coming through the wall means one of the neighbor's goats has once again wandered too near your side of the lane. Medieval women learned to read mornings with the same seriousness that priests read calendars or lords read rent tallies. Weather was not background. It entered the house through the seams, into the bread, into the joints, into the washing, into whether the wood would catch quickly or only sulk in smoke. You bend over the hearth again and add one more piece of kindling, then another. Light gathers slowly along the edge of the room, enough to show the patched knee of your shift, the shadow of the chest, the pale curve of a child's cheek. The first proper warmth of the day touches not your face but the back of your hands. And that seems right somehow. So much of a woman's life in this world is felt first in the hands. Cold, heat, dough, wool, blood, milk, soap ash, water, fever. They are the body's first witnesses. For a moment, before the room fully wakes, there is something almost tender in the house's dependence on you. Not flattering, not fair, but intimate. The room waits for your movement. The children sleep because you rose. The fire burns because you knelt. Morning itself seems to require your permission to proceed. Then one child coughs, another turns, and the day remembers to become noisy again. The room is still only half visible, but your body no longer needs sight for most of its work. You know the placement of things the way a river knows its own stones. The ladle hangs slightly askew from the peg beside the hearth. The better bowl is tucked behind the cracked one because children always reach for what survives best. The little bundle of dried thyme is tied higher than the others because the dog once got into the lower bunches and sneezed for an entire afternoon. The mending basket sits under the stool with the wobbling leg. A small heel of yesterday's bread waits in the cloth by the chest. Even in the dark, your hands reach toward the right objects almost without needing you. That is its own kind of intelligence, one of the countless domestic literacies women carried in their bodies without ever being invited to name them. Outside, the sky is still a rumor. You can feel the weather before you properly see it. A certain damp in the air means the path to the well will be slicker than yesterday. A certain stillness means frost has settled hard enough to silver the yard and rim the bucket with cold. A certain smell coming through the wall means one of the neighbor's goats has once again wandered too near your side of the lane. Medieval women learned to read mornings with the same seriousness that priests read calendars or lords read rent tallies. Weather was not background. It entered the house through the seams, into the bread, into the joints, into the washing, into whether a child's cough worsened, into whether the wood would catch quickly or only sulk in smoke. You bend over the hearth again and add one more piece of kindling, then another. Light gathers slowly along the edge of the room, enough to show the patched knee of your shift, the shadow of the chest, the pale curve of a child's cheek. The first proper warmth of the day touches not your face, but the back of your hands. And that seems right somehow. So much of a woman's life in this world is felt first in the hands. Cold, heat, dough, wool, blood, milk, soap ash, water, fever. They are the body's first witnesses. For a moment, before the room fully wakes, there is something almost tender in the house's dependence on you. Not flattering, not fair, but intimate. The room waits for your movement. The children sleep because you rose. The fire burns because you knelt. Morning itself seems to require your permission to proceed. Then one child coughs, another turns, and the day remembers to become noisy again. By the time the first pale line of light touches the shutter crack, you are already into the true machinery of morning. Water next. The bucket is by the door, damp from yesterday, and leaking slightly from a seam you mean to fix once a dozen more urgent things. Stop interrupting. Which means perhaps never. You gather your skirts, pull on shoes that are more honesty than comfort, and step outside into the yard. Mud receives you immediately. The ground in a medieval village is never neutral. In winter it is hard and cruel. In spring it is a soft conspiracy of muck. In summer it bakes and cracks. In autumn it remembers rain better than the sky does. Today it is wet, gray, cold, and only mildly hostile. At the well there is already another woman, because there is always another woman. Her shawl is tighter than yours. Her cheeks are red from wind. Her bucket is better than yours, And you notice that in the same instant, you notice she looks more tired than yesterday. Between women like you, conversation begins in usefulness. A greeting, a complaint, a bit of weather, a question about whether the miller really raised his fee again. A mention that old Thomas down the lane is coughing blood. A request, if you have any beeswax left, or if perhaps after noon you might spare a moment to look at a child's rash, or if your husband could be asked whether he has seen a loose goat near the lower field. You say yes, because the network only works that way. Nobody survives village life alone. Even women who dislike one another trade favors when weather, childbirth, or hunger narrows the world enough. You carry the water back with shoulders already protesting. The bucket knocks your knee. A little spills. You do not care. Spilled water is irritating, not tragic. The children are louder by the time you return. One is crying because another took the larger piece of bread. One is fascinated by the dog's ear. One has somehow acquired soot on his face before breakfast has finished happening. You set the bucket down and take up the quern. Grain must become meal. Stone over stone, round and round. The sound is low and grinding, almost soothing if your arms do not belong to you. Flour dust gathers on your sleeve and at the edge of your hair. One child dips a finger into it and receives a mild scolding. Another wants the fox story. Already, you tell her later. Grinding grain is one of those tasks historians mention briefly, and bodies remember forever. The shoulder learns first, then the forearm, then the wrist. The movement becomes part of you. Many women's lives were made of such circular labors, literal and otherwise. Grind, stir, sweep, carry, rinse, mend, nurse, bank the fire, begin again. Repetition is not just part of the job, it is the architecture of the day. It shapes time more than bells do. By noon you will have gone around so many small domestic circuits that your body will feel like a wheel still turning even when you sit. The dough from yesterday waits beneath cloth, stubborn and patient. You uncover it, test it, press it, decide what it needs. More warmth, perhaps. More flour, perhaps. Your mother taught you this by showing, not by explaining. That is how so much female knowledge traveled, not through books, for most women, but through hands. Watch this. Hold it like this. No. Less water. More ash. Keep the child farther from the fire. Listen to the cough before you look at the face. Dry thyme here, not there. Bank the coals this way if the wind is from the east. Such things seldom entered written archives, but they made households possible. By midday the house is fully awake, and no one in it is grateful enough. The pottage thickens in the pot, barley and cabbage and whatever onion remains surrendering themselves to heat. You stir so it does not catch. You scrape the bottom, you add water and hope nobody notices. A child begins fighting sleep and therefore fights everyone else instead. Another has found a loose thread and begun worrying it like a philosophical problem. The dog is underfoot. A neighbor calls through the doorway to ask if you might lend a pinch of salt until market day. Of course, of course. Your day is one continuous act of keeping small shortages from turning into larger ones. And while all this happens, nobody writes your name down. No one records that this household stood because you kept standing. No one copies into a cartulary that you remembered to dry nettles before the rain, that you patched the boy's shoe with hide cut from an old strap, that you kept the fire from dying, that you stretched pottage into supper, that you soothed a fever with wet cloth and thyme, that you noticed a leak before the bedding was ruined. This is the first emotional truth of the story, and perhaps the strongest. Medieval women were not absent from history because they did nothing. They were absent because the kinds of things they did were treated as background, even when that background held the whole visible world upright. Girlhood does not last long under such conditions. 1 year you are still sleeping with a rag doll tucked against your ribs, still daydreaming while sweeping, still forgetting to pull in the washing before rain. The next year the adults around you begin speaking in practical tones about your future. Not because you have become wiser, not because your body feels ready to bear the meaning being placed upon it, but because convenience has ripened. Because a household nearby needs another pair of hands. Because a widower needs help. Because land and alliances and dowry and labor have their own cold calendar, and your pulse is not consulted by it. Historians rightly argue over marriage ages, because the medieval world was not one village repeated forever. Region mattered, class mattered, town and countryside differed. The church's formal rules were one thing, actual local custom was another. Yet, even with all that complexity, the emotional truth remains sharp. For many girls, adulthood arrived when other people found it useful. Menstruation was not merely bodily change, it was social transfer. Suddenly, your life could be negotiated. Your mother may haggle on your behalf with care and love. That does not make the experience feel less strange. A goat here, a small chest there, a little linen, a promise of land, stony and narrow, a tool, a blanket, a spin of language around what you are worth to another household. Everyone may tell themselves this is security. Often it is. Marriage can keep a woman from starvation as much as it can trap her inside labor. The cruelty of many historical arrangements is that they were often both oppressive and practical at once. People did not live inside clean moral diagrams. They lived inside necessity. The wedding passes quickly compared with the life that follows. Church, words half heard. Bread, blessing. A ribbon, if anyone has one worth wasting on the day. Your best tunic, not white. Because white is for fantasy and linen that never meets real life. The priest speaks. Your husband smells faintly of damp wool and smoke, and a field worked hard enough to have entered him. He is not necessarily unkind. He is simply not chosen by the kind of inner test your heart might have set for. This is how belonging begins, not in affection but in repeated competence. The first year of marriage teaches you the house by humiliation and recovery. You scorch the porridge once and spend the rest of the week feeling every glance as if it were smoke in your eyes. You forget that his youngest hates cabbage softened too far, and she spits it back into her bowl while the whole table goes silent. You hang linen too near the hearth, and it takes the scent of smoke so fiercely that even after rinsing it still smells faintly singed. You cry only once where anyone might hear, then learn quickly to save tears for tasks that can excuse them. Washing at the basin, perhaps, or cutting onions if onions are plentiful enough to provide an alibi. Yet there are small survivals too. The first loaf that rises exactly as it should and browns without burning. The first time your husband says nothing because nothing went wrong, which in a house like this counts almost as praise. The first child who reaches for your apron instead of looking toward the door for someone else. First evening you bank the fire and realize your hands made the room feel warmer than it did when you arrived months before. Belonging in marriage is often not romance at all. It is the slow accumulation of habits until the house begins to answer back to your body. The seasons help and hinder in their turn. In spring the mud makes every task slower. But the return of green gives even tired women a reason to look outward. In summer, the laundry dries faster, and the children are easier to shove outdoors. though the heat under all those layers can make your temper feel like a kettle left too near the edge of boiling. Autumn smells of apples if you are lucky, of rot if you are not, and always of urgency. Winter narrows the world to fire, wool, grain, and endurance. By the end of your first year, you no longer think of the house as his in the same way. Not because law has changed, because labor has. Your hands are in the walls now, in the folded cloths, in the order of the chest, in the very way the room expects morning to unfold. Sure, because everyone has agreed he will, the walk to his house is the true wedding, if anything is. Not the words, the leaving, your mother's hands at your sleeve one last time, your brother pretending not to look upset, the lane longer than it ever was when you walked it as a daughter. The knowledge that a whole life can change, not in thunder, but in the sound of your own shoes on a muddy path beside a man who does not yet know how you take your bread, how you fear the dark, or what stories made you laugh at 7. His house may not be much different from the one you left. That can be comforting or crushing depending on the day. A single room, perhaps a loft if he is fortunate, packed earth, smoke, a chest, a table, straw, a place for the animals near enough to hear them through the night and smell them all the time. You enter carrying a bundle and a silence. The bowls are not where your hands expect. The latch sticks differently. The roof leaks in new places. The hearth smokes at another angle. You do not belong here yet, which is one of the loneliest feelings in the medieval female life cycle. Not maiden anymore, not mother yet, not mistress of the house in any full sense. Just the new wife-bee community among women is built less from declarations than from entrusted tasks. A woman who asks you to look at her child's rash is giving you more than an errand. She is handing you fear in a manageable shape. A woman who borrows salt is often borrowing reassurance that this lean week has not singled her out for private ruin. A woman who lingers 1 minute longer at the well may only be resting her shoulder, but she may also be measuring whether she can admit that she is late with her bleeding, or that her husband has taken to drinking too much of the ale meant for sale, or that her mother, in the house at the far end of the lane, has not risen from bed properly in 3 mornings. Medieval villages could be harsh, nosy, punitive places, but they were also held together by female attention of an almost supernatural precision. Women knew whose child had grown too thin, whose roof looked worse after the last wind, whose cow was ailing, whose daughter had gone quiet, whose husband had not come home last night. Sometimes that attention turned cruel. Often, it turned useful first. The year itself also teaches cooperation. In lambing season, everyone listens for the thin, frantic sounds of trouble. In harvest, women share the strain of preserving whatever can be dried, salted, packed, turned, tucked, hidden, and defended from rot. In winter, when darkness arrives too early and the cold settles low in the bones, households lean harder on one another. Someone has extra onions. Someone else has broth. Someone has the recipe for easing a child's chest. Someone has lost their fire and needs a coal. Someone has news from market and brings it like a small hot object cupped in both hands. All of this passes mostly among women, because women are the visible machinery of continuity. If there is laughter at the well, it is often quick and dry, the kind that has learned not to waste itself. If there is tenderness, it comes sideways. A woman notices your bucket handle is splitting and hands you cord without comment. Another sees you are limping and carries half the wash load back with you as though it were nothing. One tucks a bit of honeycomb into your palm when no child is looking. None of this is written down. Yet a village without such exchanges would not last a season. A's make that easier. They have survived too much to waste quick tenderness. They watch whether you scorch the porridge, whether you let the dough dry, whether you know enough to dry a cloth away from direct smoke, whether you notice when a child's cry means pain and not habit. Their judgments are not always cruel. Often they are simply the hard-edged version of communal standards built from danger. A sloppy woman can get a household sick. A foolish woman can waste grain. A dreamy one can let fire take the roof. Trust must be earned by getting the ordinary things right. So you learn. Of course you do. You learn where he keeps the seed grain. You learn how he likes the ale. You learn that the floor near the wall turns damp in long rain. You learn which hen pecks. You learn whether he is the sort of husband who speaks, or only eats, or sleeps, or expects. You learn how to fold yourself smaller at table if his moods require it. You learn how to mark little private victories when no one praises them. The first decent loaf. The first time the stew comes out exactly right. The first day one of the older women nods instead of correcting you. This is how belonging begins, not in affection, but in repeated competence. The first year of marriage teaches you the house by humili night. In the new house is its own initiation. Such marks are personal signatures even when no one reads them as such. Over time, the house takes your shape as surely as you take its burden. The shelf near the hearth grows less cluttered because you have sorted the bowls by use and survival. The drying herbs move to a different beam because smoke catches them too harshly where they hung before. The old blanket is folded twice, not once, because you have learned that doubling it over the children's feet keeps them quieter through the coldest part of the night. A crack near the shutter is stuffed in winter with wool scraps, and in summer left open for air. You begin to understand how much of domestic mastery is simply noticing and then not forgetting. There are days when the room seems unbearably small. Its walls too close, its air too warm, its floor too alive with footsteps, children, hens, and the constant need to bend or lift or turn. Yet there are other days when the very smallness feels protective. During hard rain, when the roof holds well enough and the pot is full and the children are all within sight, the room can briefly feel like a whole defended world. The dog by the hearth, the basket of onions, the drying socks, the spoon you prefer, the little bundle of herbs tied where only you and perhaps your eldest daughter really know to look. A medieval peasant house is not a place anyone would choose for leisure, but within its boundaries women made systems, and systems are a form of power even when no one uses that word. You know which jobs can be paired so that the body suffers less. Stir the pottage while nursing. Spin while watching the older two scrape rushes from the floor. Mend in the final light while someone else carries in wood. Send the children to pick kindling and call it a game. Wash one set of linens while the broth thickens. Rest your back for a few breaths by claiming you are listening for the boil. The house is not just a site of labor. It is also a puzzle solved repeatedly by women whose intelligence has been mistaken for obedience so long that the mistake has become a custom. His breathing, to the unfamiliarity of the room, to the way your own body has suddenly become part of an arrangement larger than your wishes. He may not be cruel. He may only be tired. Many men in this world are tired in ways that make them clumsy with gentleness. That does not save women from the consequences. Marriage often asks the girl to become a wife in one day, and a mother not long after, with no formal space in between for fear, adjustment, or refusal. Days accumulate. That is how this life deepens. The house becomes legible under your hands. You know which stool rocks, which pot catches first, which child wakes earliest, where the best dry wood can be hidden from damp, how many eggs you can spare at market without leaving the weak too thin. The dog begins to sleep near your feet, instead of only the hearth. The older women begin, perhaps, to include you in the exchange of practical speech that passes for intimacy here. Someone asks your advice on preserving onions. Someone else leaves a baby with you while she fetches a midwife. Such moments mean more than they appear to. Community among women is built less from declarations than from entrusted tasks. A woman who asks you to look at her child's rash is giving you more than that. An errand. She is handing you fear in a manageable shape. A woman who borrows salt is often borrowing reassurance that this lean week has not singled her out for private ruin. A woman who lingers 1 minute longer at the well may only be resting her shoulder, but she may also be measuring whether she can admit that she is late with her bleeding, or that her husband has taken to drinking too much of the ale meant for sale, or that her mother, in the house at the far end of the lane, has not risen from bed properly in 3 mornings. Medieval villages could be harsh, nosy, punitive places, but they were also held together by female attention of an almost supernatural precision. Women knew whose child had grown too thin, whose roof looked worse after the last wind, whose cow was ailing, whose daughter had gone quiet, whose husband had not come home last night. Sometimes that attention turned cruel. Often it turned useful first. The year itself also teaches cooperation. In lambing season, everyone listens for the thin, frantic sounds of trouble. In harvest, women share the strain of preserving whatever can be dried, salted, packed, turned, tucked, hidden, and defended from rot. In winter, when darkness arrives too early and the cold settles low in the bones, households lean harder on one another. Someone has extra onions. Someone else has broth. Someone has the recipe for easing a child's chest. Someone has lost their fire and needs a coal. Someone has news from market and brings it like a small hot object cupped in both hands. All this passes mostly among women, because women are the visible machinery of continuity. If there is laughter at the well, it is often quick and dry, the kind that has learned not to waste itself. If there is tenderness, it comes sideways. A woman notices your bucket handle is splitting and hands you cord without comment. Another sees you are limping and carries half the wash load back with you as though it were nothing. One tucks a bit of honeycomb into your palm when no child is looking. None of this is written down, yet a village without such exchanges would not last a season. The house itself deserves its own history, because women spent so much of life inside structures that never counted as historical subjects and yet shaped them profoundly. A one-room peasant house is a geography of overlapping functions. The table is eating surface, workbench, mending station, sometimes birthing bench. The hearth is cooking place, light source, gathering place, sickbed companion, drying rack, child hazard, and emotional center. The chest holds all in. This is not metaphor. It is administration without public credit. Even the smallest household runs on decisions so constant they can look invisible from the outside. How much barley may be ground now, and how much must be kept against late winter? Whether the eggs go to market for ribbon, needles, salt, and perhaps one sweet apple for a child, or whether they stay because next week may be thinner. Whether the old shirt becomes rags now, or one more mending can still be squeezed from it. Whether the lamb should be sold, kept, or quietly traded to kin. Whether the sick neighbor truly needs broth, or whether giving it away will leave your own pot too poor. Men appear in the records beside transactions, because they often held legal voice, But many daily economies were managed by women whose calculations never received the dignity of that name. Market day, when it comes, reveals this clearly. The walk itself is labor. The carrying is labor. The bargaining is labor. Standing in wind beside baskets of eggs, onions, thread, rough cloth, or a little ale is labor. Knowing whom to trust, when to lower a price, when to pretend indifference, when to save your better stock for later in the day, when to keep something back rather than let it go too cheap, all of it is skill. If the money passes ultimately into a husband's hand, the practical intelligence behind it may still be yours. Many women must live with this split: responsibility without full authority, expertise without public ownership. And yet, within the household, everyone knows, even if no one articulates it properly, who keeps count of what remains. Ask a man how much rye is left, and he may guess. Ask the woman who has stretched it through 6 suppers and 3 wet weeks, and she can tell you by the weight of the sack in the half-dark. Ask which child will outgrow shoes first, which cloak must be patched before the first frost, which neighbor may need help at birthing time, which field edge floods earliest, whose roof sounds wrong in strong wind. These are not the glamorous forms of knowledge institutions reward. They are the forms of knowledge that keep institutions from starving. Tipple places. The bed or pallet is sleep. Sex, childbirth recovery, nursing, fever, grief. Nothing is specialized because survival cannot afford specialization. Privacy is nearly impossible. Silence is a luxury mostly available in church, in fields at the edge of work or in the mind. Children sleep within reach. Animals occupy nearby logic. The floor is always a little dirty because clean in the modern sense requires time. Water, soap, and space, and those are all contested. The room smells of broth, smoke, earth, wool, dog, leather, and weather. Yet within this compression, women still create micro-orders. A place where the herbs hang, a folded cloth kept dry, a spoon reserved, a patch of wall used for tools, a habit of sweeping that leaves one small groove near the hearth over years. Such marks are personal signatures even when no one reads them as such. Now the truly endless work begins, spinning first perhaps, because there is always spinning. Wool into thread, thread into cloth, cloth into usable life. Spinning is not decorative, it is economy in motion. Your fingers learn tension. Twist, release. The spindle drops, turns, rises, fills. You work while talking, while watching children, while listening to broth simmer, while thinking of nothing at all, while thinking of everything. In much of medieval Europe, women's textile labor was foundational, not supplemental. Yet because it often took place in the home or in female-dominated spaces, it could be treated as natural rather than skilled. There is no better trick for devaluing labor than assigning it to women and calling it instinct. Brewing is another such task. Ale is daily, ordinary, necessary. Water can be suspect. Ale is nourishment, hydration. Social glue, a modest pleasure, and sometimes one of the few reliable calories going. You clean the vessel, you watch the mash, you know by smell when something has gone right and by other smell when it has gone terribly wrong. Beer and ale belonged to women's work in many settings until profit and regulation drew male institutions more aggressively into the trade. The pattern will become familiar if you stare at history long enough. Women begin industries in domestic contexts. Once those industries become profitable, formal male structures emerge to define, police, and often exclude. Then laundry. Medieval laundry is not one task, but an assault. Water hauled, heated if possible, ash lye prepared, cloth soaked, beaten, wrung, scrubbed, rinsed, lifted heavy when wet, laid out or hung where weather permits. Hands split, backs protest, linen roughens before it softens. You do not wash for aesthetic purity. You wash because damp filth rots cloth and bodies alike, and because whispers about dirty household linen travel faster than centric. A woman can be called neglectful, slovenly, lazy, or worse from the state of a hem, and never fully rinse the label off. Patching follows. Every garment becomes second-hand to itself before it dies. Elbows wear first, knees. Seam the body learns to proceed half-mended. Postpartum life in this world is a study in unfinished recovery. Your hips still feel wider than you recognize. Your belly is tender when the child kicks against it from outside. Now, rather than within, milk leaks through linen just when you have managed to forget it for a few minutes. Your breasts harden painfully if the baby sleeps too long, then ache when he wakes ravenous again. Bleeding lingers. Sleep comes in scraps. Everyone around you speaks as though the danger has passed once the child is delivered. But women know better. The real fear often begins after the room empties, after the midwife wipes her hands, after the broth has gone lukewarm, and everyone starts looking at the next task. If there are older children, they are not suspended while you recover. They still fall, scrape, cry, demand, tug, wake, and need. The pottage still thickens. The fire still asks tending. A husband may try, or may think he is trying, and still leave most of the true work untouched, because the true work is everywhere. In noticing, soothing, timing, cleaning, remembering, adjusting, and carrying the emotional weather of the house. Women after childbirth often occupy a strange position, praised in theory, indispensable in practice, and physically least able just when dependence on them is greatest. There may be rituals meant to mark the transition back to ordinary life, churching ceremonies in some places, special broths, advice from older women, rest prescribed for a few days if the household can possibly bear it. But poverty shortens all prescriptions. The room keeps asking things of you, and eventually you answer because the baby needs linen. The child needs a wash, the bread is going stale, and no one can live indefinitely in the suspended state between danger and duty. Yet even here, there are small protected moments, the first dawn when the child sleeps against you, and no one else is awake. The smell of his head, milk and soot and warmth, the astonishment that your body, brutalized as it feels, still produces nourishment. The way an older daughter comes near and strokes the baby's hair with one finger, already rehearsing a tenderness she will someday be expected to know by instinct. These moments do not erase the cost. They simply make the cost legible as part of something larger than suffering alone. They fully wear out, which sounds fortunate until you realize it only means another round of cutting down, letting out, resewing, salvaging. Old cloth becomes smaller cloth, then rag, then stuffing, then fuel. Scarcity teaches a material imagination modern abundance has half forgotten. A woman holding a torn sleeve does not see damage. She sees the remaining possibilities inside it. Feeding everyone is its own endless discipline, beans to soak, greens to gather, roots to store, herbs to dry, bones to stretch, scraps to convert into broth, bread to guard from mold, and children in equal measure. You learn the timing of hunger in every body around you. Your husband eats differently from children. A nursing child empties you faster than any work. A fevered one wants only broth. Winter wants fat. Summer wants what will not spoil by noon. The pig's feet can become food. The turnip leaves too. Nothing is beneath attention because neglect is simply hunger delayed. And when something breaks, you become repair in human form. A hole in the roof, a strap gone, a stool split, a door latch loose, a child's shoe torn, a cracked pot not yet past saving. There is no separate department called maintenance. There is you, and perhaps your husband for larger tasks. Though even then, the noticing tends to be yours before it becomes his. Women in households often function as what modern people would call managers of complex systems without ever receiving the authority the title implies. They coordinated resources, anticipated failures, and kept the whole thing from collapsing under ordinary strain. This is not metaphor. It is administration without public credit. Because the work never stops, rest becomes fragmented and almost furtive. A few breaths while stirring, a brief sit at sunset with wool in your hands, so that even sitting still looks useful. A child asleep against your side, a minute by the door looking at weather as though reading it were not also labor. These small pauses matter immensely. Without them, fatigue becomes not just physical but spiritual, a flattening of inner life. Women found such pauses where they could and often disguised them as something else. Prayer, mending, watching the pot, waiting for the bread. Simply standing still with purpose on your face. Illness enters this life like a thief who knows the house well. Not once in a while, dramatically, but often in little increments. A scratch in the throat, a fever behind the eyes, an ache low in the belly after birth, a wound that ought to close and does not, a cough that lingers, a breast that hardens painfully while the infant still demands milk, a child's looseness of bowels, a husband's infected finger. Sickness in the Middle Ages is never only personal. It radiates through the whole household because labor cannot pause without cost. You wake one morning with heat in your cheeks and a heaviness in your limbs that feels wrong. Not ordinary tiredness. Something deeper, more slippery. But still, the fire must be lit. Still breakfast, still the child at your breast, still the dough. Women often kept moving through illness because there was nobody waiting in reserve to become them. Folk remedies fill the gaps where formal medicine does not reach. Willow bark for pain, garlic and honey, hot cloths, vinegar. Rest if you can steal it, prayer if you cannot. Some remedies probably worked more often than later dismissal allows. Others worked only in the sense that they gave action to the frightened. Action can sometimes be its own medicine. Childbirth-related illness deserves its own shadow in this story because it haunted so many women's lives. Fever after delivery, retained matter, infection, milk fever, bleeding that does not stop, a belly that remains tender in the wrong way. The midwife comes, if she can be spared or if anyone decides the matter is urgent enough. She brings cloths, knowledge, caution, herbs, hands that have seen too much. She may help. She may fail. She is not a miracle worker. No one is. One of the coldest truths of medieval womanhood is that bringing life forth often carried women alarmingly near death. And society treated that proximity as tragic, expected, and structurally normal all at once. If you survive, there is no grand recovery period. You sit by the hearth with broth. You bleed, you ache, you nurse, you rise too soon, because there is bread to make, and washing to do, and another child chewing on something dangerous. Your husband may say take it easy while handing you the heavier pot. He may mean well. Patriarchy is not undone by good intentions when entire systems assume women recover in time to continue serving them. The body learns to proceed half-mended. So much female endurance is less about full healing than about functioning before healing is possible. Motherhood arrives then, not as a soft focus glow, but as a condition of divided attention that rarely ends. The baby feeds before dawn, after dusk, through the night, between other tasks, during arguments, while the stew is boiling, while the well rope burns your palm, while the older child cries over a scraped knee. Breastfeeding is nourishment and tether all at once. Your body is no longer solely yours, even in exhaustion. Wet nurses exist elsewhere, for other classes, for houses with money and different structures of labor. In your house, the child feeds from you because there is no alternative worth naming. Motherhood in this world is also surveillance. Watch the fever. Watch the cough. Watch the stool. Watch the rash. Watch the fontanelle. Watch whether the baby is strong enough to cry angrily or to quee another female script. However limited, changes the shape of one's own thoughts. When you imagine the convent, you do not imagine perfection. You are too practical for that. You know stone can be cold, rules can be sharp, and women living closely together can wound one another with as much precision as they can comfort. You know even cloistered life contains politics, discipline, sore feet, hunger on fasting days, and labor enough to bow the shoulders. But still, the differences matter. A bell calling to prayer is not the same as a husband calling for ale. Copying a page by candlelight is not the same as scraping the pot while a child clings to your skirt. Learning Latin psalms is not the same as hearing Latin only as inaccessible sound from the back pew. You imagine the order of the day there, matins in the dark, the shuffle of wool habits along stone, breath visible in winter corridors, a bowl of something plain yet predictable, garden paths edged with medicinal plants, a workroom where hands move over linen, inks, or herbs rather than over endless washing and animal feed. Voices joined in chant so that no one woman's tiredness carries the whole room. Even if the convent does not offer freedom, it offers distribution. And distribution of burden can feel like mercy. Perhaps what stirs you most is not the learning itself, though books have a power even when only half imagined. Perhaps it is the idea of female time arranged differently. In the house, every hour splinters under interruption. In the convent, even interruption follows a rule. The soul may still be disciplined, but the body is not in constant service to childbirth, marital expectation, and domestic emergency. A woman there may still be corrected, confined, and denied much, yet she is also part of a female institution, not merely a female function within a male household. This thought does not make you less devoted to your children or less real in your own world. It simply gives the mind a second room to walk in. Sometimes that is enough to change the feeling of the first room, not by enlarging it in truth, but by loosening the belief that it is the only shape a woman's life can take. Tories while picking lice, they carried children through fields and winters and hunger and sickness, and still made songs out of them emotion. There is nothing sentimental about this labor, but tenderness runs through it anyway like thread through coarse cloth. And always the losses, one child who never drew a full breath, one who did, and then did not last the month, one buried after a cough, took a turn in the night, one whose cradle stays in the corner longer than anyone comments on. Women carried such grief bodily, in the wrists, in the milk that came after death anyway, in the silence around certain names, in the habit of waiting a little before stitching initials into cloth, or speaking of a future too confidently. Historical averages cannot hold the emotional weight of that. Only the image can. A woman in the dark with a feverish child against her shoulder whispering stay because stay is the whole prayer. Yet children also keep a house from becoming only a site of labor. They bring absurdity, a daughter handing you weeds with the solemnity of flowers, A boy attempting to feed broth to the dog with a spoon bigger than his hand. The first laugh after an illness passes. The way babies smell of milk and warmth and soot all at once. These things mattered because joy in such lives was often minute, sudden, and embodied. Not grand happiness, not fulfillment in any modern self-expressive sense, but flashes of relief and affection bright enough to carry a woman across another week of drudgery. Church shapes the rhythm of all this, whether you like it or not. The bell tolls, and the day bends around it. You go because everyone goes. Because faith is assumed, and attendance is social survival as much as devotion. The chapel smells of wax, damp stone, old wood, wet cloaks, and bodies that walked there. 'Tis how knowledge survives under pressure, through codes so ordinary no one thinks to fear them until too late. There are evenings when the children are nearly asleep, and the room is finally quiet enough that you can sort your dried leaves properly. You do it by the edge of the hearth, or in the dim outside light if the weather is kind. The names move through your mind like a second litany, one as serious as any church prayer. This for cough, this for swelling, this for women's blood when it comes too hard or not at all. This for bruises, this for worms, this because the old woman 2 houses down swore by it and lived long enough to make people listen. The knowledge is never whole. It is a patchwork. Like everything else women inherit, part memory, part experiment, part what worked once, and therefore deserves one more try. Sometimes another woman comes in the evening, when fewer eyes are on the lane. She sits on the stool with the bad leg, and lowers her voice without needing to be told. Perhaps her child has not slept. Perhaps her own bleeding has turned strange. Perhaps she asks whether there is anything for the ache in her mother's joints, or the swelling in her husband's throat, or the rash beneath a baby's neck. You hand her something wrapped in cloth, or tied with twine, and tell her how to steep it, how long to wait, when to stop. She thanks you too quickly. You both pretend this is nothing. That pretense is part of the safety. There is danger not only in accusation, but in envy. What? A woman useful enough attracts dependence, and dependence can sour into resentment if the same woman later refuses, fails, or simply seems too self-assured. So you stay modest in manner even when your hands know exactly what they are doing. You let the priest claim God healed the child. You let the husband believe the cough eased because the weather shifted. You do not need applause. You need to keep practicing. In another world, this knowledge might have become authorship, schooling, formal medicine, guild recognition. In yours, it remains embodied, whispered, domestic, deniable. Yet its scale should not be mistaken for smallness. How many medieval lives continued because some woman knew what leaf to crush, what root to dry, what broth to brew, what fever cloth to change at midnight? We cannot count that. It happened too often and too quietly, more as sound than meaning. Yet sound has power too. You know when to kneel, when to stand, when to cross yourself, when to say amen without fully knowing what you are endorsing. Religion in medieval women's lives is a knot of comfort and control. The sermons can scold. Eve returns often, dragging with her every lazy explanation for female weakness, temptation, or supposed need for obedience. Your husband is reinforced as head. Your silence is praised as virtue. Your suffering is made spiritually useful by those who do not bear it in your form. Yet, there is also Mary, candles, chant, the soft order of ritual, the beauty of stained light across stone, the relief of kneeling beside other women whose backs ache too. The knowledge that grief may be brought somewhere, even if the answer is not satisfying. Faith can be shelter and wound at once, Women lived inside both truths. For some women, the convent offered another arrangement. Not freedom exactly, but an alternative discipline, one not governed by husband and recurring childbirth. If family, fortune, or circumstance placed you there, you might learn letters, you might sing the hours, you might tend a physic garden, you might handle books, copy texts, memorize psalms, find in the repetition of liturgy a structure different from household repetition. Stone walls instead of thatch, bells instead of pigs, ink instead of dough. At least some days, no life in the Middle Ages was free of labor. But labor changes character according to who controls it and what forms of dignity surround it. You imagine it sometimes, a nun visiting from a nearby house, the smell of beeswax and clean linen, the thought of a cell, narrow but yours, a fob. Pages of a room where silence is not a luxury stolen from chaos, but part of the architecture. You know convent life has rules, severity, politics, and its own forms of hardship. Yet compared to the domestic life laid out by pilgrimage is one of the few forms of travel that can clothe longing in holiness. When you do travel, the body remembers it long afterward. Market day in the next village can feel almost like pilgrimage simply because it rearranges the usual horizon. The path runs differently there. The river bends at another angle. The bread tastes more or less salted. The faces do not know yours yet, and so watch you with that faint local suspicion every stranger receives. You carry your own spoon, your own cloth, your own small caution. The children tug. The wind finds every gap in your clothing. But still, for a few hours, the world is larger than the line between house, well, and field. Travel also teaches how fragile a woman's safety can feel once she leaves the circle of familiar names. An inn means strangers. A barn means cold and uncertain company. A roadside chapel means relief, but only if reached in time. Men on the road may be kind, indifferent, drunk, pious, curious, or dangerous, and a woman often cannot know which until too late. No wonder so many female journeys are group journeys. Company is shield, witness, and warning system all at once. And yet the road has its seductions, the sight of a distant church tower where you have never knelt, a merchant's cloth brighter than anything in your chest at home, a language half understood in the mouth of a traveler, stories of shrines, abbeys, and cities carried by those who have gone farther. Even if you return the same day, muddy and tired and no richer, something inside you has been moved outward and will not fit back into ignorance quite so neatly. For some women, pilgrimage offers this sensation with holiness folded around it. To walk toward a shrine with other women, to sleep in strange places, to pray in a church whose stone you have never touched before, to be for a little while more traveler than wife or daughter, that must have felt like breathing through a cracked wall and discovering open air beyond. Whether the miracle came or not, the journey itself carried a charge. It proved the world was wider, and that your own feet, under the right blessing, could cross more than the village expected. Ed around prayer, learning, and institutional continuity, rather than around male household authority. It is no accident that some of the women whose voices survive from the Middle Ages survive because they were enclosed where literacy was possible. Back in your own house, however, the dough still needs kneading. The baby still wants lifting. The goat still bleats as if offended by your momentary philosophical detour. And so the convent becomes one of those soft alternative lives women sometimes carried inwardly, like a private room in the imagination. Not because every woman wished to be a nun, but because the existence of another female script however limited, changes the shape of one's own thoughts. Herbs return us to the ground. You know plants, not loudly, never loudly. Sage, thyme, lavender, mint, fennel, comfrey, yarrow, rosemary. Some for the pot, some for the chest, some for births and bleedings and coughs and aching joints and sour stomachs. Your garden is practical before it is pretty, though pretty things survive there too because women often tuck beauty into utility where they can. A rose that should not be so alive, lavender hanging under raffloth. Nothing in such a garden is mere decoration. It is food, medicine, scent, memory, insurance against the body's next betrayal. And because you know these things, you must also know when to hide them. A woman who keeps people alive with herbs can become suspect the moment luck turns against the village. The baker's wife recovers from a cough after your infusion, and you are wise. A calf is born dead, the week after you were seen gathering roots, and suddenly your wisdom grows a shadow. Much later, centuries will formalize witchcraft panics on a horrifying scale, but suspicion of female knowledge has deeper roots than the trials themselves. Male clerical culture often distrusted what it did not regulate, and communities under stress seek explanations that can be pinned to a person. Clever women, especially poor ones, make convenient pins, so you speak of herbs as kitchen things when possible. Rosemary for flavor, certainly, mint for the breath, honey, because everyone loves honey. You never say motherwort first. You never say I know a way to bring the bleeding down unless the room is safe, and the woman before you is half dying anyway. You share by implication, by gesture, by doing. Quiet competence becomes both shield and service. Your daughters learn the safe names first, and the truer ones later. This is how knowledge survives under pressure. Through codes so ordinary, no one thinks to fear them until too late. Clothing adds another layer to the female day, literally and socially. First, the shift, closest to the skin, stiff from washing and wear. Then the kirtle, then perhaps another dress or overdress, apron, belt, veil, or wimple, hair pinned. Hidden, managed, because exposed female hair means too many things, and most of them invite scrutiny. Clothes are not fashion in any simple sense. They are class. Modesty, weather, work, marital status, and discipline arranged into cloth. A woman dresses not to display herself, but to be read correctly enough to avoid unnecessary trouble. In winter, the wool scratches and saves. In summer, it clings and torments. In rain, it drinks water like bitterness and hangs from your body with all the generosity of a curse. Shoes leak, hems stain, head covering slip. Yet even within this narrow range, women find room for self-expression in tiny seams. Colored thread from onion skins, better stitching at the cuff, a ribbon kept past practicality, decorative work performed not because anyone will reward it, but because making beauty in a life of necessity can feel like a form of prayer, not addressed to God. Travel belongs mostly to other people's stories. You may go to market, to a neighboring village, to a shrine if fortune and permission align, to your mother's house after a birth, to your husband's kin, to a lord's manor with goods, to a burial. Complexity is not a modern invention. Widowhood also alters the way other women look at you. The very young watch with a kind of startled fascination, as if you have crossed into a country they fear but cannot stop imagining. The married look more carefully, measuring both your grief and your new margin of movement. Older widows may, for the first time, speak to you as one of their own, not because sorrow ennobles, but because it removes one of the last illusions. They know how the bed feels colder and wider. They know how silence can first terrify and later become almost luxurious in places. They know which men will offer help with too much eagerness. They know which forms must be signed, which rents challenged, which cousin must be watched lest he suddenly remember an interest in your boundary line. Your daughters change too. They begin to see you not only as the person who kept the pot from burning, but as someone who can answer at the door in her own name. If there is a sale to be made, you make it. If there is a dispute over a hen or a strip of field edge, you speak. If there is a journey to market, you decide whether to go. These are not dramatic freedoms by modern measure, but within the structure of a medieval woman's life, they can feel astonishing. Authority, even narrow and precarious authority, changes posture, changes how you carry the bucket, how you look at the lane, how long you let someone wait before answering. Some widows discover a taste for business they were never permitted to name while married. The rhythm of coin, grain, cloth, credit, and debt had always been familiar. Now it becomes overt. You know who pays late, whose son drinks too much, which neighbor can be trusted to return a loan of barley, which peddler cheats on weights, which priest may waive a small obligation if approached with the right mixture of piety and persistence. Men might call this shrewdness if they admired it in one another. In a widow, they may call it something less flattering. You continue anyway. Grief remains. A widow does not simply transform into independence as if mourning were a curtain to be tied back. There are nights you still turn toward the empty space automatically. Mornings when hearing another man's laugh in the lane makes your throat tighten because for one foolish instant, your body answered before memory did. But grief, like labor, becomes braided into the life that follows, rather than canceling it. You carry both. Women often had to, tea for wood or herbs. But travel for its own sake is not arranged around female desire in most ordinary medieval lives. The world beyond your usual paths arrives as a rumor from peddlers, pilgrims, tinkers, soldiers, and clerics. You hear of cities, of silk, of coasts, of noble ladies in colors so vivid they sound invented, of mountains, of foreign queens, of relics, of roads that never turn back toward your village. These stories widen the sky inwardly, even when your feet remain in familiar mud. Pilgrimage is one of the few forms of travel that can clothe longing in holiness. A woman might go to a shrine for healing, for penance, for a vow, for a dead child, if they are lights above a wider landscape. Below those lights stretches the great, unrecorded country of ordinary women. The woman who knew exactly how much grain to hold back to get a household through March without anyone naming the skill as economics. The girl who listened at the edge of adult talk and learned inheritance rules more accurately than her brothers because she had to know how they would one day limit her. The brewer whose ale kept half the lane from drinking sickness. The spinner whose thread moved through a market under someone else's name. The midwife who arrived in snow with hands already warm from rubbing them together on the walk. The mother who could recognize by sound alone which child was crying from hunger and which from fever. The old widow who became keeper of half the parish memory because younger women came to her for recipes, remedies, and the names of who had once courted whom. There were women who negotiated quietly between feuding households because men trusted them less and therefore watched them less. Women who hid a little coin in hems, women who kept devotional objects and healing roots in the same chest and saw no contradiction. Women who taught daughters how to look modest while missing nothing. Women who laughed at the priest once he had gone. Women who memorized stories they could not write and passed them on anyway. Women who held together farms after death, plague, bad harvest, or war, had stripped the obvious sources of authority from a place. Women whose skill in patching, preserving, and anticipating made them seem merely practical when in fact they were strategists of survival. If history had been written more often from the kitchen bench, the birthing stool, the washing trough, the herb bed, or the path to the well, we would know many more of their names. Instead, we infer them from inventories, court complaints, wills, recipes, miracle stories, guild exclusions, household accounts, and the places where documents accidentally reveal the labor behind the legal shell. The challenge is not that women were absent. It is that historians so often must reconstruct their presence from records not built to honor it. Even that reconstruction, though partial, should humble us. What survives despite neglect is usually only the sturdiest fragment of a much larger life. Or hope. The journey is never easy. Hard bread, sore feet, shared sleeping, suspicion from strangers, weather always near. Yet within it lies one intoxicating thing. Motion authorized by something higher than domestic need. To walk with a group toward a distant holy place is still to be walking away from ordinary supervision for a time. No wonder pilgrimage appears in so many medieval imaginations as both devotion and release. Still, most women's movement remains bounded, if unmarried, watched by father or kin, if married, expected to travel in relation to household needs, if widowed, sometimes freer, though age, poverty, or danger may narrow that freedom. Invisible maps shape the village, places one does not go alone after dark. Men one does not approach casually, houses entered only with reason, paths taken in groups. Boundaries were not always written, but women knew them because bodies learn boundaries quickly when the cost of crossing them is felt socially or physically. Then comes widowhood, sudden or slow, terrible and strange. The day after a husband dies, the house sounds altered. Silence itself has a different weight, one fewer breath in the room, one pair of boots no longer needed, one voice absent from its ordinary habits. Grief has texture here too, a bowl no one reaches for, a patch of wall you keep looking at because his coat hung there, a child asking a question your body cannot answer. You mourn him not as a category, but as the exact person who split wood that way, left a latch that way, snored crookedly, forgot to rinse the cup, said your name only when necessary and sometimes in a way you now miss enough to ache. Yet widowhood can also open a thin door no marriage had. In many places, widows could hold property, run businesses, lend money, appear in court, and act with a legal autonomy wives were denied. The reality varied enormously with region, class, debt, and male relatives, but the possibility mattered. For some women, widowhood meant poverty, vulnerability, and pressure to remarry fast. For others, it meant the first taste of directing a household openly under their own authority. Grief and freedom do not cancel each other. They can arrive holding hands. You wake one morning after the burial and realize no one is waiting to tell you how thick he likes the stew. No one is there to fill the doorway with his judgment or his habit. The children still need feeding. The rent still exists. The roof still leaks. But the house sounds differently yours. You decide what to plant. You decide whether to sell eggs now or later. You decide whether to walk to market yourself. The first such decisions can feel less like power than like vertigo. Then, slowly, like breath, widowhood teaches practical things fast. How to negotiate, how to hide fear in front of men who smell weakness as opportunity, how to count what remains, how to ask for help without surrendering the whole household, how to sharpen a blade, how to patch a fence, how to let daughters see you in command without turning command into hardness. Some widows remarried. Some had no realistic alternative. Some did not, and in not remarrying discovered a kind of interior expansion no earlier life stage had offered. Telling a daughter you may never marry again, and seeing shock turn into wonder on her face, might be one of the most radical small moments available to a medieval village woman. At night, the house is quieter. You miss him. You do not miss everything. Both statements can be true without canceling. You miss the extra body warmth in winter. You do not miss being told to hush when you had the better idea. You miss his hand on the bucket. You do not miss handing over every market coin. Women's emotional lives refuse the simplicity historians sometimes crave. Love can exist inside unjust structures. Relief can coexist with sorrow. Complexity is not a modern invention. And from here, late in the story, the lens can widen. Not away from the ordinary woman, but outward through her toward others. The women with names history kept, and the far greater number it did not. Eleanor of Aquitaine moving through courts and crusade politics. Hildegard writing, composing, advising, the Trung sisters on their elephants in another part of the world. Murasaki Shikibu writing inwardness into literature, while court life fluttered around her. Fatima Alfieri founding an institution centuries would still recognize. These them, they are not the whole female past. They are lights above a wider landscape. Beneath them stretch the women who never entered parchment, except as wife of, widow of, daughter of, servant of, accused of. The peasant who kept a village alive through a hard winter by managing grain carefully. The mother who saved 3 children from fever with knowledge her own might, made it intimate. The same can be said of memory at the end of the day. Memory does not always preserve what is official. It preserves what is repeated with feeling. A mother's tune while stirring porridge, the exact way an old woman folded cloth before putting it away. The smell of rosemary crushed between thumbs. The timing of a church bell heard through mist. The phrase spoken whenever a child had fever. The rough joke told at the well every spring when the mud first swallowed a shoe. These things travel farther than many decrees, because they live in bodies and voices rather than in parchment. Women's history often remained alive, precisely because it was carried this way, not by institutions, but by repetition affectionate enough to survive. So when you imagine the woman by the fire stitching a name into cloth, imagine also all the names that were never stitched and yet were somehow kept. In daughters who inherited a certain gesture with the ladle. In sons who remembered their mother's hand at the back of a fevered neck long after they learned to speak with authority over others. In neighbors who measured kindness by comparing it to hers. In villages where everyone knew, even if they did not say so, which woman could be trusted when things went wrong. Reputation for women was often a dangerous thing, but it could also be a hidden monument, not carved in stone, carried in mouths. The fire lowers more now. The room has that late-night softness in which even rough objects begin to seem forgiving. The chest by the wall, the folded cloth, the bowl turned upside down to dry, the spindle still on the bench, the child who kicks once in sleep and then goes quiet again. The dog with one ear folded the wrong way. Outside, the weather continues without asking what it means. Inside, the pause lengthens just enough to feel real. That is where I want the story to rest, not on a thesis, on a room, on a woman whose life has been widened by our attention just enough that she is no longer faceless in the dark. If tomorrow will ask everything of her again, tonight can at least return one thing: witness. Not the public witness of record, law, or song, but the private witness of having been seen clearly for a while. seen not as symbol or lesson, but as a full human being composed of labor, ache, skill, worry, tenderness, adaptation, humor, fear, endurance, and the strange stubborn spark that kept women making lives inside systems not built to praise them. That spark is part of the warmth in the room now. Let it stay. H, the seamstress whose work clothed half the parish, the alewife whose brew kept people safer than the well, the widow who negotiated better than any man expected, the young wife who calmed conflict between households because she understood everyone's hunger, the healer who never named herself, the nun who copied quietly by candlelight, the girl who learned to listen for weather in the thatch before she learned to read a single word. History is full of these women even when documents are not. The surviving archives tilt because pens had owners and institutions had preferences. Most formal records were produced by male clerics, officials, landlords, bureaucrats, and legal men concerned with taxes, property, inheritance, sin, and power. Women enter most clearly when those systems notice them. But life happened far outside those frames. If you want to feel the real scale of women's contribution in the Middle Ages, you must look not only at who signed, but at who sustained, who baked, who spun, who birthed, who brewed, who mended, who watched the sick through the night, who remembered which field drained poorly, who carried remedies, who raised the next generation of workers, soldiers, priests, daughters, mothers, and widows. The world written by men sat on foundations women maintained. It is tempting from a distance to make these women only victims, or only symbols of resilience. Both approaches are too easy. They suffered real constraint, danger, pain, and erasure. They also joked, desired, adapted, judged, loved, envied, prayed, hid things, exchanged gossip, protected daughters, resented husbands, found beauty in thread, made clever bargains, and occasionally carved out room for themselves where none was meant to exist. They were not lessons, they were people. Good sleep history has to remember that. Otherwise, the past becomes either propaganda or pity, and both make poor blankets for the night. So now the story returns to where it should return. The house, the fire, the woman whose life has carried us through all these layers. Evening again, the children finally sleeping, one on a pallet near the hearth, one with a hand still closed around something small and meaningless that mattered all day, the dog at the foot of the bed or by the coals, the room smelling of smoke, broth, old straw, wet shoes, dried herbs overhead, maybe a little milk souring in a cloth if tomorrow's cheese is going to become what you hope. Her hands are tired. Her back is tired. Her mind still lists tomorrow's tasks of its own accord. Yet for a few minutes now, the work has paused. She sits with mending. Perhaps. Because even rest in such a life often needs an alibi. Needle in hand, cloth in lap, fire low, the kind of silence that is never complete but close enough to feel medicinal. Outside, a cart wheel once on the road. Far off, an owl, wind in the branches. Someone else's dog answering yours from a distance. Inside, the tiny shifts of sleeping children, the house breathing with them. She threads the needle. She pulls it through. Stitch by stitch, the cloth comes back together. Women's history may not always be legible in public monument, but it is legible in repaired things. Imagine that she has a scrap of linen set aside, not for display, not for sale, just for herself. A foolish thing, perhaps, a small thing. She bends over it and begins stitching letters slowly in the firelight. Perhaps she knows a few, perhaps not enough for a proper sentence. Perhaps it is only a mark, a pattern, a shape repeated from memory, rather than a formal written name. But let us imagine gently that she is of those forgotten women history took for granted. The act matters more than the accuracy. To name is to resist disappearance, even if only in cloth kept in a chest. This is the image I want to leave you with, because it gathers the whole story into one human gesture. Not battle, not law, not sermon. A woman by a low fire, late in the day, making sure that one name, one memory, one trace will not vanish entirely into usefulness. Medieval life rarely allowed women the luxury of public permanence, so they made private permanence where they could, in recipes, songs, remedies, embroidery, tools passed down, daughters instructed, and houses kept alive through weather after weather. The archive of women was often soft, domestic, oral, handmade. That did not make it small. It made it intimate. Now let the fire lower. Let the stitch be tied off. Let the cloth fold. Let it rest in the chest beside the bed. Let the bed remain rough, but warm enough. Let the children stay sleeping. Let the dog press one final sigh into the dark. Let the rafters hold. Let the wall keep out what wind it can. Let the embers breathe red beneath their ash, preserving morning in secret. Let the woman's hands unclench slowly, as if they too have been told for once that nothing more is demanded of them tonight. Tomorrow will come with the same old claims: bread, water, fire, thread, children, church, weather, need, perhaps pain, perhaps one small joy, perhaps both before noon. But tomorrow is not here yet. For now the room is dim, and the work is paused, and the woman is still entirely real. Not because a record says so, but because the house around her bears the shape of her life in every object it contains. So let the name remain hidden in the folded cloth. Let the folded cloth remain in the chest. Let the chest remain against the wall. Let the wall hold up the house. Let the house hold the heat. Let the heat soften the dark. Let the dark stay kind. Let history, for one gentle night, stop asking to be made of kings and battles, and allow itself to become what it mostly was for most people. Work, weather, worry, small beauty, food stretched thin, bodies close to one another, prayers muttered half in hope, and women keeping everything from coming apart. And if sleep wants you now, it can find you here, not in the castle, not in the cathedral, not in the chronicle, but in the one-room house at the edge of dawn and embers, where a woman whose name was almost lost sits for one moment without moving and lets the night hold her back. Let the bowl rest empty. Let the spindle stop. Let the bell go silent. Let the child breathe. Let the name remain, and very quietly now, let the night be enough.